The year was 1863. In a small town in southern Pennsylvania, the fate of a nation was about to be sealed. Two powerful armies, each fighting for the future of America, were on a collision course. On one side, the Confederacy, desperate to maintain its way of life, desperate to secede. On the other, the Union, determined to preserve the nation's unity, to stop the spread of slavery. Both sides had fought bloody battles before, but neither knew what lay ahead. The skies above Gettysburg seemed to hum with tension. Would this battle finally be the turning point in the American Civil War? Would the North repel the South, or would the South strike a blow so decisive that the Union would never recover? But it wasn't just a battle of soldiers. It was a battle of strategies, of leadership, of courage, and of unrelenting determination. Men, no different from you and me, fought for what they believed in, and that belief would shape the future of this land. The Battle of Gettysburg would be a story of bravery, loss, and the power of destiny. But could the tide of war really turn with one single clash? What would happen when these two armies met in a struggle that would change the course of history? A deadly standoff. The first shot. The morning of July 1, 1863, dawned gray and heavy. Union forces, under the command of Major General George Meade, had been stationed in Gettysburg as part of a routine movement to confront General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Neither side knew that this seemingly innocent town would become the battleground for the war's most defining struggle. It began with a simple reconnaissance mission, a few skirmishes at the outskirts of Gettysburg. But within hours, those skirmishes turned into full-blown combat. The Confederates, seeking to disrupt the Union's movements, found themselves face to face with Union troops near McPherson's Ridge. The first shot was fired at 7:30 a.m. A lone Confederate sharpshooter's rifle rang out. The sound reverberated through the hills, signaling the beginning of a brutal, three-day clash. But no one could have foreseen the chaos that was about to unfold. The Union soldiers, outnumbered at first, fought valiantly to hold their ground. The Confederates, led by the skilled but reckless General Lee, pushed forward, determined to break the Union's resolve. What neither side knew at that moment was that this would not be just another battle. The very fate of America, its soul, was on the line. Could the Union hold its ground, or would the Confederacy's fiery resolve overwhelm them? By the end of the first day, hundreds of soldiers lay dead or wounded in the blood-soaked fields. But the true question lingered: who would control Gettysburg? And what would this battle mean for the rest of the war? The high ground, the fight for Little Round Top. As the Union forces struggled to maintain their position, another critical point in the battle came into focus. The hills around Gettysburg were not just rolling terrain. They were strategic high points that could provide a commanding view of the battlefield. And on July 2nd, General Lee's forces turned their attention to Little Round Top, a crucial hill that the Union had to hold at all costs. Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, commanding the 20th Maine Regiment, found himself in a position that could change everything. Little Round Top was under threat. The Confederate forces, under the leadership of General Longstreet, knew that if they captured this high ground, they could turn the tide of the battle. The Union line would break. Chamberlain and his men were exhausted, and they had already fought the entire day. But as the Confederates launched a relentless assault, Chamberlain made a choice that would go down in history. He ordered his men to hold the line at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing their lives. With the Confederates closing in, Chamberlain issued a bold command: fix bayonets. The men charged downhill, an audacious move that stunned the Confederates. It was a last-ditch effort to push the enemy back. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. But was this victory enough? Could Chamberlain and his exhausted regiment hold their ground, or would the Confederate forces continue their relentless push to win the battle? The fight for Little Round Top would become one of the most iconic moments of the battle. But the Union was far from safe. The Confederates still had their sights set on victory. Would their final assault succeed? A pivotal moment: Pickett's charge. By July 3rd, the battle had reached its boiling point. The Union forces, though battered, had held on. But General Lee, unwilling to retreat, made a fateful decision. He would launch one final, decisive assault, the infamous Pickett's charge. General George Pickett's division, 12,000 men strong, would march across open fields toward the center of the Union line, a mile away. It was a reckless move, but Lee believed that a full-scale assault might break the Union's resolve once and for all. The Confederate soldiers began their march, crossing the field under heavy artillery fire. The Union forces, entrenched behind stone walls, held their fire until the Confederates were within range. And then the cannons roared. The ground shook under the weight of the barrage. Confederate soldiers, relentlessly advancing, were mowed down in waves. The Union line held strong, despite the Confederate onslaught. As Pickett's men approached the crest of the hill, the Union soldiers stood firm, their resolve unshakable. But the charge was a disaster. The Confederates were decimated. Pickett's men, caught in the deadly crossfire, retreated in chaos. Over 50% of the soldiers who charged that day were either killed, wounded, or captured. The Confederacy's hope for victory at Gettysburg was shattered. Was this the turning point the Union had been waiting for? Could Lee recover from this devastating loss? And what would the consequences of this catastrophic charge be for the South? The aftermath, the deadly cost of victory. When the dust finally settled after Pickett's charge, the reality of the battle's toll became tragically clear. The Confederate forces, despite their initial successes, were left reeling from the devastating losses they had sustained. Nearly 50,000 soldiers, Union and Confederate alike, were dead, wounded, or missing. The Union had held, but at what cost? General Lee's army was broken and exhausted, their hopes of victory dashed. For the first time in the Civil War, the South was forced to retreat, its momentum, its morale, and its resources drained. The Union had gained a significant victory, but the cost of that victory would haunt both sides for years to come. Union General Meade, while hailed for his leadership, could not ignore the toll on his own troops. The Union soldiers, though victorious, had suffered severe losses. The fields of Gettysburg, once quiet and peaceful, now bore the scars of battle, blood-soaked earth, abandoned cannons, and the haunting cries of the wounded. But as the Confederates retreated, there was something even more profound at play. What would this victory mean for the war going forward? Could the Union use this momentum to end the war, or would Lee find another way to regain the initiative? The answer lay in the weeks to come, and the haunting question remained: would Gettysburg be remembered as the turning point of the Civil War? Or would the South find a way to reclaim its strength? The strategic fallout: a war on two fronts. In the wake of Gettysburg, the Confederacy faced an undeniable strategic setback. Lee's hopes for a decisive victory in the North had been dashed, and with the failure of Pickett's charge, his army had suffered irreparable losses. But while Lee's forces were on the retreat, there were still pressing concerns for the Union. General Ulysses S. Grant was not yet a household name, but his successes in the Western theater of the war were beginning to shift the balance. At the same time, President Abraham Lincoln was struggling to maintain unity among the northern states, many of which were war-weary and reluctant to continue the fight. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union or defeating the Confederacy. It had become a test of endurance, a contest of wills between two nations, both determined to survive at any cost. And Gettysburg was merely one part of a much larger picture. Could the Union, with its victory at Gettysburg, push the Confederacy out of the war once and for all? Or would Lee regroup and strike again, turning the tides in a dramatic fashion? The question lingered in the minds of both armies. What would the next move be in this deadly chess match? The legacy of Gettysburg: a nation divided. The Battle of Gettysburg was not just a turning point in the Civil War, it was a defining moment in American history. In the wake of the battle, President Lincoln delivered his famous Gettysburg Address, a speech that would come to symbolize the Union's resolve and the ideals for which they fought. Lincoln's words, delivered just a few months after the battle, sought to redefine the purpose of the war, not just as a fight to preserve the Union, but as a fight for equality, freedom, and the very soul of the nation. But while Lincoln's address resonated across the world, the scars of Gettysburg remained deeply embedded in the fabric of American life. The thousands of lives lost on those blood-soaked fields left families shattered and communities forever changed. The wounded, those who survived the battle, carried both physical and emotional scars that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Gettysburg also marked a shift in the Union's war strategy. The North, having won this pivotal battle, now believed that the Confederacy could be broken. But would this belief be enough to sustain the momentum? Could they carry the fight to the South and finally end the war? For the Confederacy, Gettysburg was a brutal reminder of their vulnerability. But Lee's army was far from finished. What would they do next? A new commander, Ulysses S. Grant, and the war's final phase. In the months that followed the Battle of Gettysburg, a new figure began to emerge in the Union Army, Ulysses S. Grant. Although his name was not yet as well known as that of Meade or Lee, Grant's strategic vision was about to change the course of the war. Grant's focus shifted from isolated battles to a broader strategy of relentless pressure. He understood that in order to defeat the Confederacy, the Union had to take control of not just key territories, but also choke off the South's ability to fight. Grant's aggressive, unrelenting tactics would eventually come to define his leadership. Meanwhile, the Confederacy, reeling from Gettysburg and other defeats, found itself on the defensive. Lee had lost momentum, but he was not defeated. He would fight until the very end. The war, it seemed, was far from over. Would Grant's strategy of total war finally break the Confederacy's resolve? Or would Lee, with his knowledge of terrain and battle, find a way to turn the tide? The tide turns, the fall of Vicksburg and the long road ahead. While the Union Army dealt a blow to the Confederacy at Gettysburg, another critical battle was unfolding in the West, the Siege of Vicksburg. Grant's army had laid siege to the city, determined to break the Confederacy's hold on the Mississippi River. The fall of Vicksburg would sever the South in two, cutting off vital supplies and disrupting Confederate logistics. It was a crushing blow to the Confederacy, and when the city finally surrendered on July 4, 1863, just days after the Union's victory at Gettysburg, it symbolized the growing strength of the Union and the weakening resolve of the South. But while the Confederacy suffered these losses, they were far from finished. Lee's army still threatened the Union, and with the war showing no signs of ending, both sides were entrenched in a struggle that seemed impossible to resolve. Could the Union capitalize on its victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg to finally bring an end to the war? Or would the South rally for one final push? The endgame, Lee's surrender at Appomattox. As the year 1865 dawned, the Confederate army, battered and broken from years of brutal combat, could no longer sustain itself. General Lee's forces, once proud and fierce, were now depleted, outnumbered, outgunned, and unable to continue their fight. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee, knowing that the Confederate cause was lost, made the fateful decision to surrender to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The meeting was not one of anger or bitterness, but of weary acceptance. Lee, in his Confederate uniform, met Grant, who was dressed in a simple private's coat. The two men had once been comrades at West Point, but now their roles were irrevocably changed. Grant, in an act of magnanimity, offered generous terms of surrender. Lee's men would be allowed to return home, keeping their horses and personal belongings. The Union sought no revenge, only the restoration of the nation. The surrender at Appomattox marked the official end of the Civil War. The South's dream of independence was extinguished. But the war's legacy lived on. The United States had been preserved, but the wounds of the war would take generations to heal. The nation was forever changed. Could the Union rebuild itself from the ashes of war? Would the scars of slavery and division heal in time? The answers to these questions would unfold over the years to come, but one thing was certain: the Battle of Gettysburg, the turning point of the war, had set the stage for this final, decisive moment. Conclusion. The Battle of Gettysburg was a turning point in the American Civil War, a clash that not only determined the fate of the Union but also defined the future of the United States. It was here that the Union's resolve was tested to its limits and where the Confederacy's dreams of victory began to crumble. The cost was staggering: tens of thousands of lives were lost, and the landscape of America was forever altered. But the battle's significance went beyond just the bloodshed. It shifted the balance of power, gave the Union the momentum it needed, and marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. As General Lee's retreat began, the Union seized the initiative, pushing the Confederacy onto the defensive and into a war of attrition that it could not win. Yet, Gettysburg was just one chapter in a larger story. The Civil War did not end with a single battle. It took years of struggle, sacrifice, and suffering to bring the conflict to its conclusion. The ultimate victory at Appomattox, following the devastation of Sherman's march, sealed the fate of the South. But even as the war ended, the United States still faced the monumental task of healing its divisions, rebuilding its country, and grappling with the legacy of slavery. The echoes of Gettysburg would continue to shape the nation for generations.